Life has a funny way of catching you off guard. You think you have everything figured out, your routines, your relationships, your plans for the future. And then, in an instant, something changes. It could be a conversation, a glance, or even just a feeling. And suddenly, everything you thought you knew doesn't feel so certain anymore. For me, it all started with my younger brother, Ethan. To most people, he was just my little brother, someone I had grown up with, shared childhood memories with, and, honestly, never thought much about beyond the typical sibling dynamic. We had our differences, sure, but nothing out of the ordinary. He was always the quieter one, the dreamer, the one who spent hours lost in his own world while I was more focused on my own responsibilities. Growing up, we weren't particularly close. I was older, busier, always preoccupied with school, friends, and later, college. Ethan was just there. A part of my life, but in the background. He was the kid who stole my snacks, the one who annoyed me with his endless questions when I was trying to read. But he was also the one who, in his own quiet way, was always there for me. I just never really noticed it. That all changed when I came back home after finishing college. I expected everything to be the same: the house, my parents, and of course, Ethan. But when I saw him again after years apart, something was different. He was no longer the awkward, lanky kid I had left behind. He had grown, physically, yes, but also in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on. There was a confidence in the way he carried himself, a presence that hadn't been there before. And for the first time in my life, I found myself noticing him. It was unsettling. Wrong, even. This was Ethan, my brother. The same kid who used to trip over his shoelaces, who cried when he lost his favorite toy, who used to follow me around like a shadow. So why did it feel like I was looking at a stranger? I told myself it was nothing, just the natural effect of time. People grow, people change. I was just seeing him as someone independent now, not just as my younger brother. But as the days went by, that explanation stopped making sense. Because it wasn't just that he had changed. It was the way he looked at me too. It started with little things, small, almost unnoticeable moments. The way his gaze lingered a second too long when I spoke. The way he laughed at my jokes, even the bad ones. The way he found reasons to be around me, to talk, to stay close. I kept brushing it off, convincing myself I was imagining things. But deep down, a voice I didn't want to acknowledge whispered the truth. Something was shifting between us, and I didn't know how to stop it. The night it all truly began was an ordinary one. At least, that's what I thought. It had rained earlier in the day, and the backyard was still damp, the scent of wet earth lingering in the air. The sky was clear now. The stars spread across the dark canvas above us, and the cool breeze carried a sense of calm. I had always loved nights like this, quiet, peaceful, the kind that made you forget the chaos of life for just a little while. Ethan and I sat outside on the porch, sipping on cold drinks, letting the night settle around us. It wasn't unusual for us to talk like this, reminiscing about our childhood, sharing stories from our separate lives. But that night, something was different. "I used to think you were the coolest person in the world," Ethan said, his voice softer than usual. I chuckled, shaking my head. "Used to?" He smiled, but it wasn't his usual teasing grin. It was something else. Something unsure. "Yeah. When we were kids, I always wanted to be just like you. You had everything figured out. You were confident, smart, fearless." I turned my head to look at him, surprised by the admission. "You never told me that." Ethan shrugged, looking up at the stars. "Didn't think I needed to." A comfortable silence stretched between us, but I could feel something unspoken hanging in the air. I should have let it go, should have ignored the strange feeling twisting in my chest. But I didn't. What changed? I asked, my voice quieter now. He hesitated, fingers tightening around his glass. I don't see you the same way anymore. I frowned. What do you mean? Ethan exhaled slowly, as if weighing his words. I mean, you're still you. Still amazing, still strong. But I don't just see you as my older sister anymore. Something inside me froze. My mind raced, trying to grasp the meaning behind his words, but at the same time, I already knew. I swallowed hard, forcing a nervous laugh. That's a weird thing to say, Ethan. He turned to look at me then, and I felt my heart skip a beat. His eyes were steady, searching mine, waiting for a reaction. Is it? I should have shut it down. I should have laughed it off, changed the subject, pretended like I didn't understand what he was saying. But I didn't. Because in that moment, sitting under the stars, I couldn't lie to myself anymore. I felt it too. A shift, a pull, something I wasn't ready for. So I did the only thing I could. I stood up, brushing my hands against my jeans, pretending I was cold. We should head inside. It's getting late. Ethan watched me for a moment, then nodded. But as he got up to follow me inside, I felt the weight of his gaze on my back. And I knew, no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, things between us would never be the same again. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, Ethan's words echoed in my mind. I don't see you the same way anymore. I tossed and turned, pulling the blanket over my head, as if that could block out the thoughts racing through my mind. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself that I had misunderstood him, I knew the truth. And worse, deep down, I knew that a part of me didn't want to ignore it. The next morning, I avoided him. It was childish, but I wasn't ready to face whatever was happening between us. So I busied myself in the kitchen, focusing on making coffee, scrolling through my phone, anything to keep my mind occupied. But of course, Ethan wasn't going to let that slide. Are you avoiding me? His voice startled me, and I nearly spilled my coffee as I turned to see him leaning against the doorway. He was watching me carefully, arms crossed, waiting for an answer. I forced a casual shrug. Number. Why would I be avoiding you? Ethan raised an eyebrow. You tell me. I hated how well he could see through me. It wasn't fair. I just have a lot on my mind, I muttered, taking a sip of my coffee and avoiding his gaze. He didn't respond right away, and I hoped, that maybe he would let it go. But instead, he stepped closer, his voice softer now. Is it about last night? My grip on the mug tightened. I wanted to tell him no. I wanted to say that I hadn't even thought about it, that it was a meaningless conversation, that nothing had changed. But when I finally looked at him, I knew he wouldn't believe me. Ethan, I hesitated, swallowing hard. I don't know what to say. For a long moment, he just stared at me. Then, to my surprise, he smiled. But it wasn't the usual teasing or easygoing grin I was used to. It was something sadder, something knowing. You don't have to say anything, he said, backing away. I just needed to know. And just like that, he walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there with my heart pounding. I should have felt relieved, but instead, I felt like I had just let something slip away. And I wasn't sure if I wanted it back or not. The days that followed were strange. Ethan didn't bring up that night again, and I was grateful for it. But something between us had shifted, and no matter how much we tried to pretend otherwise, we both felt it. We weren't fighting. We weren't avoiding each other. But there was a distance now, an invisible line we were both too afraid to cross. And yet, despite the silence, despite my attempts to push it all away, I started to notice things I had never noticed before. The way he ran his hand through his hair when he was thinking. The way his voice softened when he spoke to me. The way he lingered just a second longer than necessary when we crossed paths in the hallway. I told myself I was overanalyzing, that I was just seeing things differently because of what he had said. But deep down, I knew the truth. One evening, I was curled up on the couch, flipping through a book I wasn't really reading, when Ethan walked in. He hesitated in the doorway, as if debating whether to turn around. But then he sighed and sat down on the other end of the couch. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound coming from the ticking clock on the wall. Then, finally, he spoke. "I don't want things to be weird between us." I swallowed hard, keeping my eyes on the pages of my book. "They're not." Ethan let out a quiet laugh. "You're a terrible liar." I closed the book with a sigh and finally looked at him. I don't know how to act around you anymore." His expression softened. "Then don't act. Just be." It sounded so simple, but nothing about this felt simple. I wanted to tell him that I didn't feel anything, that this was all in his head. But I couldn't, because the truth was, I felt it too. The pull, the shift, the thing neither of us could name, and I didn't know how to stop it. I stood up abruptly, needing an escape. "I'm going to bed." Ethan nodded, but there was something in his eyes, something I didn't have the courage to face. As I walked away, I could feel his gaze lingering on me, like a weight I couldn't shake off. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't going to go away. No matter how hard I tried to fight it. I thought that if I ignored it long enough, it would go away. That maybe, if I kept my distance, the strange tension between us would fade, and things would go back to how they used to be. But life doesn't work that way. And neither did Ethan. It was a rainy Sunday afternoon, the kind where the whole world felt slow and quiet. The sound of raindrops tapping against the windows filled the house, and the air smelled like damp earth and brewing coffee. I was sitting at the dining table, flipping through my phone, when Ethan pulled out a deck of cards and dropped it in front of me. "Let's play," he said casually. I raised an eyebrow. "What?" "You heard me," he said, smirking. "It's just a game." I hesitated. There was something in his voice, something light, playful, but also something deeper. A challenge. I could have said no. I should have said no, but I didn't. "Fine," I said, picking up the deck and shuffling the cards. "But I'm not going easy on you." Ethan grinned. "Wouldn't expect you to." At first it was normal. We played, we laughed, we teased each other the way we always had. And for a little while, it felt like things really were normal again. But then, something shifted. It was subtle at first, just a glance, a touch, a moment that lasted a little too long. Every time our fingers brushed as we passed the cards, my stomach twisted in ways I didn't understand. Every time I looked up and caught him watching me, my heart pounded in my chest. I told myself I was imagining it, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then, it happened. I reached for the deck at the same time he did, and for a brief second, our hands overlapped. It was nothing. Just a touch. A simple, meaningless touch. But it didn't feel meaningless. The air in the room shifted, heavy with something unspoken. I should have pulled away. I should have laughed it off. But I didn't. And neither did he. For the first time, we just looked at each other, really looked. And in that silence, I knew. I wasn't imagining this. It was real. And that terrified me more than anything. I barely breathed. Ethan's hand was still under mine, warm against my skin, and neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. I could hear the rain outside, the steady rhythm of it tapping against the windows, but everything else, the world, the room, even time itself, felt like it had come to a stop. I should have pulled away. I should have broken whatever moment was happening between us. But I didn't. Instead, Ethan was the one who moved first. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his hand, his fingers brushing against my palm before slipping away. It was such a small thing, but it sent a shiver down my spine. "I need to ask you something," he said, his voice quieter than before. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "What?" He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. Then, "You feel it too, don't you?" I froze. My instinct was to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, that this was just in his head. But I couldn't, because I did feel it. And the way he was looking at me, the way his eyes searched mine, waiting for an answer, told me that he already knew the truth. I dropped my gaze, my fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "Ethan, I don't know what you want me to say. I just want you to be honest," he said, his voice steady. Honest. The word felt heavy, like it carried too much weight. But how could I be honest about something I didn't even understand? I forced a shaky breath. "Even if I did, it doesn't change anything." "Doesn't it?" Ethan asked, leaning forward slightly. "Because it feels like it's changed everything." I shook my head, pushing my chair back. "I can't do this." Ethan's expression didn't change. He didn't look hurt or angry, just resigned. "I'm not asking for anything," he said softly. "I just needed to know." And with that, he stood up and walked away, leaving me alone with the pounding of my heart. I should have felt relief, but all I felt was the weight of everything we weren't saying. The tension between us became unbearable. Days passed, and neither of us spoke about what had happened at the table. But it was there, in the way we moved around each other, in the silence that stretched between us. I pretended things were normal. I went through the motions of my routine, convinced myself that if I acted like nothing had changed, maybe it would go back to how it was before. But Ethan wasn't playing the same game. He stopped pretending. He didn't avoid me. He didn't act like everything was fine. Instead, he watched me. Not in a way that was obvious or intrusive, but in a way that made it impossible for me to forget what had happened. Like he was waiting, testing me. One night, I found myself sitting alone in the living room, staring at the flickering glow of the television without really watching it. My mind was too full, too tangled with thoughts I didn't want to have. I didn't hear Ethan come in until he sat down beside me. He didn't speak right away. He just sat there, close but not touching, his presence enough to make my heart race. Finally, he broke the silence. "This isn't going away, is it?" I swallowed hard, gripping the blanket draped over my lap. "Ethan, I just need to know," he said, his voice low. "If you want me to stop, to forget everything, I will. But if you feel it too..." He trailed off, waiting. I squeezed my eyes shut. I wanted to lie. I wanted to tell him that I felt nothing, that he was wrong, that we could go back. But I couldn't. Not when every glance, every breath, every second in the same room as him made my pulse race. Slowly, I turned to face him, and the moment our eyes met, I knew I was standing at the edge of something I couldn't walk away from. "I don't know how to stop it," I whispered. Ethan exhaled, like he had been holding his breath, waiting for me to say the words. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. But in that moment, something between us shattered. There was no going back. The moment stretched between us, thick and unbreakable. I could feel my heartbeat hammering in my chest, so loud I was sure Ethan could hear it too. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us moved. But the weight of everything unsaid filled the air between us, pressing down on me, making it impossible to breathe. Then, slowly, so slowly it felt like time itself had slowed down, Ethan reached out. He didn't touch me. Not yet. His fingers hovered just inches from mine. A silent question. A test. I should have pulled away. I should have broken whatever this was before it could go any further. But I didn't. Instead, I let my hand shift, just enough that our fingertips brushed. It was barely a touch, but it was enough. Ethan inhaled sharply, his eyes searching mine, looking for hesitation, for doubt. I had plenty of both. But in that moment, none of it mattered. I was tired of running, tired of pretending I didn't feel what I felt. So when he whispered, "Are you sure?" I didn't trust my voice to answer. Instead, I nodded. That was all it took. The tension snapped, years of unspoken feelings spilling over in an instant. Ethan's hand closed over mine, warm and steady. It should have felt wrong. It did feel wrong. But it also felt inevitable, like something we had been fighting for so long that it had only grown stronger. I didn't know what this meant. I didn't know what would happen next. But as Ethan's fingers tightened around mine, as the silence between us filled with the sound of our unsteady breaths, I knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back. Whatever line we had been trying not to cross, we had just erased it